Chapter 8. What news the eagle brought. In the shadow of the trees at the far side of the clearing, something was moving. It was gliding very slowly northward. At first glance, you might have mistaken it for smoke, but it was gray and you could see things through it. But the deathly smell was not the smell of smoke. Also, this thing kept its shape instead of billowing and curling like as smoke would have done. It was roughly the shape of a man, but its head was that of a bird, and a bird of prey with a cruel curved beak. It had 4 arms with which it held high above its head, stretching them northward, as if it wanted to snatch all Narnia up in its grip, and its fingers, all 20 of them, were curved like its beak and had long, pointed, bird-like claws instead of nails. It floated on the grass instead of walking, and the grass seemed to wither beneath it. That sounds pretty scary. After one look at it, Puzzle gave a screaming bray and darted to the tower. And Jill, who was no coward, as you know, hid her face in her hands to shut out the sight of it. The others watched it for perhaps a minute until it steamed away into the thicker trees to their right and disappeared. Then the sun came out again, and the birds once more began to sing. Everyone started breathing properly again and moved. They had all been very still as statues while it was in sight. "What was it?" asked Eustace in a whisper. "I've seen it once before," said Tyrion, "but that time it was carved in stone and overlaid with gold and had solid diamonds for eyes. It was when I was no older than thou and had gone to be a guest of the Tisroc court in Toshban. He took me into a great temple of the Tosh, and there I saw it carved above the altar." "Then that thing was Tosh?" said Eustace. But instead of answering him, Tyrion slipped his arm behind Jill's shoulders and said, "How is it with you, lady?" "All right," said Jill, taking her hands away from her pale face and trying to smile. "I'm all right. It only made me feel a little sick for a moment." "It seems then," said the unicorn, "that there is a real Tosh after all." "Yes," said the dwarf, "and this fool of an ape who didn't believe in Tosh will get more than he bargained for. He called it Tosh. He called for Tosh. Tosh has come." "Where has the thing, gone to?" said Jill. "North, into the heart of Narnia," said Tyrion. "It has come to dwell among us. They have called it, and it has come." "Ho, ho, ho," chuckled the dwarf, rubbing his hairy hands together. "It will be a surprise for the ape. People shouldn't call for demons unless they really mean what they say." "Who knows if Tosh will be visible to the ape," said Jewel. "Where has Puzzle got to?" said Eustace. They all shouted out Puzzle's name, and Jill went round to the other side of the tower to see if he had gone there. They were quite tired of looking for him, when at last his large gray head peered cautiously out of the doorway, and he said, "Has it gone away?" And when at last they got him to come out, he was shivering the way a dog shivers before a thunderstorm. "I see now," said Puzzle, "that I really have been a very bad donkey. I ought never to have listened to Shift. I never thought things like this would begin to happen." "If you'd spent less time saying you weren't clever and more time trying to be as clever as you could," began Eustace, but Jill interrupted him. "Oh, leave poor Puzzle alone," she said. "It was all a mistake, wasn't it, Puzzle dear?" And she kissed him on the nose. Though rather shaken by what they had seen, and the whole party now sat down again and went on with their talk, Jewel had little to tell them. While he was a prisoner, he had spent nearly all of his time tied up at the back of the stable and had, of course, heard none of the enemy's plans. He had been kicked. He'd done some kicking back, too, and beaten and threatened with death unless he would say that he believed it was Aslan who brought out who was brought out and shown to them by firelight every night. In fact, he was going to be executed this very morning if he had not been rescued. He didn't know what had happened to the lamb. The question they had to decide was whether they would go to Stable Hill again that night, show puzzle to the Narnians and try to make them see how they had been tricked, or whether they should steal away eastward and meet with the help with which Runwit, the centaur, was bringing up from Cair Paravel, and return against the ape and his color marines in force. Tyrion would very much like to have followed the first plan, and he hated the idea of leaving the ape to bully his people one moment longer than need be. On the other hand, the way the dwarves had behaved last night was a warning. Apparently, one couldn't be sure how people would take it, even if he showed them puzzle. And there were color marine soldiers to be reckoned with. Podgen thought there were about 30 of them. Tyrion felt sure that if the Narnians all rallied to his side, he and Jewel and the children and Podgen, puzzle didn't count for much, would have been a good chance of beating them. But what if the other Narnians, including all the dwarves, just sat and looked on, or even fought against them? The risk was too great, and there was, too, the cloudy shape of the Tosh. What might it do? And then, as Podgen pointed out, there was no harm in leaving the ape to deal with his own difficulties for a day or two. He would have no puzzle to bring out and show now. It wasn't easy to see what story he or Ginger could make up to explain that. If the beasts asked night after night to see Aslan and no Aslan was brought out, surely even the simplest of them would get suspicious. In the end, they all agreed their best thing to do was to go off and try to meet Runwit. As soon as they had decided this, it was wonderful how much more cheerful everyone became. I don't honestly think it was this that because any of them were afraid of a fight, except perhaps Jill and Eustace, but I dare say that each of them, deep down inside, was glad not to go any nearer, or not yet, to that horrible bird-headed thing which was visible and invisible, and now probably haunting Stable Hill. Anyway, one always feels better when one has made up one's mind. Tyrion said they had better remove their disguises, as they didn't want to be mistaken for color marines and perhaps attacked by loyal Narnians that they might meet. The dwarf made up a horrid-looking mess of ashes from the earth and grease out of a jar of grease, which was kept for rubbing on swords and spearheads, and they took off their color marine armor and went down to the stream. The nasty mixture made a lather just like soft soap. It was a pleasant, homely sight to see Tyrion and the two children kneeling beside the water and scrubbing their backs and necks and puffing and blowing as they splashed the lather off. Then they went back to the tower with red, shiny faces, looking like people who've been given an extra good wash before a party. They rearmed themselves in Narnian style with straight swords and three-cornered shields. "Body of me," said Tyrion, that is better. I feel a true man again." Puzzle begged very hard to have the lion skin taken off of him. He said it was too hot, and the way it was rucked up on his back was uncomfortable. Also, it made him look silly. But they told him he would have to wear it a bit longer, for if they wanted to show him in that get-up to the other beasts, even though they were now going to meet Runwit first, what was left of the pigeon meat and rabbit's meat was not worth bringing away, but they took some biscuits, and Tyrion locked the door of the tower, and that was the end of their stay there. It was a little after 2 in the afternoon when they set out, and it was the first really warm day that spring. The young leaves seemed to be much further out than yesterday, and snowdrops were over, but they saw several primroses. The sunlight slanted through the trees, birds sang, and always, though usually out of sight, there was the noise of running water. It was hard to think of horrible things like the Tosh. The children felt, this is really Narnia at last. Even Tyrion's heart grew lighter, and he walked ahead of them, humming an old Narnian marching song, which had the refrain, "Ho, rumble, 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 drum, lord." After the king came Eustace and Podgen, the dwarf. Podgen was telling Eustace the names of the Narnian trees, birds, and plants, which he didn't know already. Sometimes Eustace would tell him about English ones. After them came Puzzle, and after him, Jill and Jewel, walking very close together. Jill had, as you might say, quite fallen in love with the unicorn. She thought, and it wasn't far wrong, that he was the shiniest, delicatest, most grateful animal she had ever met. And he was so gentle and soft of speech that if you hadn't known, you would have hardly believed how fierce and terrible he could be in a battle. "Oh, this is nice," said Jill, "just walking along like this. I wish there could be more of this sort of adventure. It's a pity there's always so much happening in Narnia." But the unicorn explained to her that she was quite mistaken. She said that the sons and daughters of Adam and Eve were brought out of their own strange world into Narnia only at times when Narnia was stirred and upset, but she mustn't think it was always like that. In between their visits, there were hundreds and thousands of years when peaceful king followed peaceful king till you could hardly remember their names or count their numbers. And there really was hardly anything to put in the history books. And he went on to talk of old queens and heroes whom she had never heard of. He spoke of Swan White, the queen who had lived before the days of the White Witch and the Great Winter, who was so beautiful that when she looked into a forest pool, the reflection of her face alone shone out of the water like a star by night for a year and a day afterward. He spoke of Moonwood, the hare, who had such ears he could sit by Cauldron Pool under the thunder of the great waterfall and hear what men spoke in whispers at Cair Paravel. He told how King Gael, who was ninth in descent from Frank, the first of all kings, had sailed far into the eastern seas and delivered the Lone Islanders from a dragon, and how, in return, they had given him the Lone Isles to be part of the royal lands in Narnia forever. He talked of whole centuries in which all Narnia was so happy that notable dances and feasts, or at most tournaments, were the only things that could be remembered, and every day and week had been better than the last. And as he went on, the picture of all those happy years, all those thousands of them, piled up in Jill's mind till it was rather like looking down from a high hill onto a rich, lovely plain full of woods and waters and cornfields, which spread away and away until it got thin and misty from distance. And she said, "Oh, I do hope we can soon settle the ape and get back to those good ordinary times. And then I hope they will go on forever and ever and ever. Our world is going to have to end someday. Perhaps this one won't." "Oh, Jewel, wouldn't it be lovely if Narnia just went on and on, like what you said it's been?" "Nay, sister," answered Jewel. "All worlds draw to an end except Aslan's own country." "Well, at least," said Jill, "I hope the end of this one is millions and millions and millions of years away. Hello, what are we stopping for?" The king and Eustace and the dwarf were all staring up at the sky. Jill shuddered and remembered the horrors they had seen already, but it was nothing of that sort this time. It was small and looked black against the blue. "I dare swear," said the unicorn from its flight, "that this is a talking bird." "So think I," said the king. "But is it a friend or a spy of the apes?" "To me, sire," said the dwarf, "it has the look of Farsight the eagle." "Ought we to hide under the trees?" said Eustace. "Nay," said Tyrion, "best stand still as rocks. He would see us for certain if we moved." "Look, he wheels. He has seen us already," said Jewel. "He's coming down in wide circles." "Arrow on string, ladies," said Tyrion to Jill. "By no means shoot until I bid you. He may be a friend." If one had known what was going to happen next, It would have been a treat to watch the grace and ease with which the huge bird glided down and lighted on a rocky crag a few feet from Tyrion, bowed his crested head, and said in a strange eagle voice, "Hail, king." "Hail, Farsight," said Tyrion, "and since you call me king, I may well believe you are not a follower of the ape or his false Aslan. I am glad of your coming." "Sire," said the eagle, "when you have heard my news, you will be sorrier at my coming than of the greatest woe that ever befell you." Tyrion's heart seemed to stop beating at these words, but he set his teeth and said, "Tell on." "Two sights I have seen," said Farsight. "One was Car Paravel, filled with dead Narnians and living Colomarines. The Tisrock's banner advanced upon your royal battlements, and your subjects are flying from the city, this way and that, into the woods. Cair Paravel was taken from the sea. 20 great ships of Colomarine put there in the dark of night before last night. No one could speak. And the other sight, 5 leagues nearer than Cair Paravel, was Runwit's, the centaur, the centaur, lying dead with a Colomarine arrow in his side. I was with him at his last hour, and he gave me this message for your majesty, to remember that all worlds draw to an end, and that noble death is a treasure which no one is too poor to buy." "So," said the king after a long silence, "Narnia is no more." There's the picture of the eagle and of the symbol. There you go. And that is the end of chapter 8.